So I want to talk about a subject that I think is one of the more interesting subjects around. And since I started this morning talking about commercialization, I will insert a number now which catches the attention. And that is that I was looking recently at a market survey for biomaterials, however biomaterials was defined as a field. And the claim, and I think it was probably roughly right, is that you expect the growth in biomaterials commercially to be something in the order of $90 billion globally over the next 10 years. And this is one of the larger commercial opportunities around. It's not what we do and what we're interested in particularly, but it's an extremely interesting and important area for reasons that I'll come to. And I know that it's one that's a big deal here on campus, so to some extent I'm going to be talking to the converted, but I actually like it that way. It's less argumentative. Let me just start by telling you what the first slide shows you. What I want to do, particularly for those of you who are students, is to give you just a little bit of a sense of material science as a field, because I'm going to be talking from the vantage of material science and going toward biomedicine. Material science is an extremely interesting area for the reason that it's the only respectable academic discipline that I know that was made up by the government, which it was. And the argument and the origin of this field was the following. After the belief was at the end of World War II that high technology stuff, airplanes and tanks and things like that, was an important part of the end result in World War II. And most of this work came from laboratories like General Electric and DuPont and integrated multidisciplinary laboratories. And Vannevar Bush managed to convince the government that it was an important and legitimate function to try to recreate in universities the kind of atmosphere that existed in these multidisciplinary industrial laboratories. And so at the same time that DARPA, then ARPA, was established, they established a series of laboratories which were called the Materials Research Laboratories. And these things were purely a government construct. And as the field developed, it turned out it was extremely interesting, and it became, in a sense, Mustafa and I know about this, there's a crude definition in material science, which is that any chemical, as soon as it becomes useful, becomes a material. So material science simply grabs all the credit from chemistry. So the evolution of the field has gone through really 3 phases, and we are in principally on the 4th phase. The first part of material science was the development of technology that was really designed for military systems. And so the current leading edge thing there is the F-22, of which we will probably buy 3 or 5 or something of that sort. It's an amazing device with high performance nickel fan blades and low radar reflectivity surfaces and all the rest of it. Fantastic. But that's pretty much over because, at least for the moment, we don't need it anymore. The second phase was the material science of information technology, which was high-performance silicon and doped insulators and zirconium oxide and all the rest of the things that go into making computer systems. And that area has also begun to fade in terms of what is I think probably the current focus of investment, which is using computer systems for various things, the web and internet and things of that sort. Then the third phase was the development of technology to respond to globalization. And what that means is to provide function at low cost. I mean, basically what globalization does is mean that whatever we had in the past you want in the future, but you want it to cost half as much and last twice as long. The third phase was to develop technology which had the characteristic that it was intended to be low cost and functional. And so that phase is also pretty much gone, its way. You can make most things that you can make in an efficient and affordable way. And there are some very interesting problems that remain. But so the question for material science is, what's the next thing? What's the next big, interesting thing? And there are a couple of opportunities, but for a variety of commercial reasons, probably the one that's the most relevant is the issue of going into medicine. And so one already sees important examples, and in due course I will show you some of these important examples, perhaps. But the issues that you can think of as examples are, for example, stents, which are, after all, metals which have a particular set of characteristics. They have to have strength, they have to be expandable, they have to be compatible with rubbing against the end of the arteries. Contact lenses are example, cochlear implants are example. There are a wide variety of materials that have the characteristic that they have to fit in legitimately to the kinds of characteristics that one finds in biomedical systems. And it raises a whole new series of problems and a whole new series of conundra in terms of materials characteristics. The part that was concerned with the effort on consumer products is really driven by this area, which is the area of globalization. And I point out that for those of you who are young, this is going to be an important deal, which is that it is going to be something in which globally products will be provided wherever they can be provided at lowest cost. And lowest cost means that for those of you who are here somewhere, you're going to be competing with St. Petersburg and with Tsinghua and with Beijing and with St. Petersburg and Moscow and all the rest of those. So it really is an important thing for you to keep in mind when you're thinking about your education, because it's going to make a world of difference. All right. So we have this kind of system now in which, if you look at the way the economy runs, we have durable goods, we have non-durable goods, we have services, and we have others. And one makes innovations in science and technology of a broad variety of sorts. And ideally, what happens is that innovation, which is your business, leads to high-end jobs. High-end jobs means good salary and some stability. And then there will inevitably be a process in which the high-end proprietary technology becomes commoditized wherever it's generated. And historically, this has been a pathway from the US to Japan to South Korea and Taiwan to India and China. But of course, these countries are getting to be very, very good at what they do in addition. They're not so far profoundly innovative in the sense of developing entire new fields. That still goes on in the United States, but boy are they good when it comes to taking an idea like flat screen display and making it really work well. Now, a very interesting thing about biomedicine is that there is a belief that the degradation in value in biomedicine may be slower than in other fields. And the reason is that medicine in every area is surrounded by a web of local expertise, doctors and nurses and hospitals, and also by a regulatory structure, which makes it very difficult to go to Korea and just import Korean medical technology. It doesn't work that way. There's too many other things that have to go on. So from the point of view of slowing this process going down to here, medicine looks like an attractive thing to do. I, at least, am getting a certain amount of feedback from this. If there is a way of limiting that, it would keep me from talking to myself. So the question to ask is, what's the next big thing? You know, what is it that's going to change the world? And there are probably several opportunities, but let me just go through a couple of these. Bio is going to be the one that we talk about. IT and photonics will continue to be a big deal for the reason that so much of the world, particularly the business world, is driven by this. But in the future, education, which is an essential part of things, entertainment, which is still one of the areas where there's unlimited, apparently, financial growth, comes squarely out of that. Intelligent machines, that is, machines which don't just calculate but actually make decisions and perform functions, is going to be very important. Globalization, the whole art of providing for a function the lowest cost. Technologies for developing economies. Most of the potential consumers in the world are actually in the third world, not in the first world. And the developing world has a whole series of characteristics in terms of its market needs and its cost structure, which are dramatically different from the ones that we work with in the first world. The commodity infrastructure, which is air and water and energy, nanotechnology, and others. So there are an unlimited range of things to think about. So we're only thinking about one. So if I think about the U.S., it is the clear global leader in this area, and there are a few areas where things slip, as stem cells and cloning, but it's not bad. Can you all still hear in the back since they've turned down? Yeah, so that's you've turned it down to the point where can't be heard now in the back, so we need to adjust that. There's a very large but troubled industry. Without going into details, the medical industry is really in grave difficulties right now because it's not making enough new drugs. And so the cost of capital and the return on invested capital have crossed. The area is now net negative cash flow, and unless something is done, Mustafa and I are going to get older, which I know Mustafa's not very graceful about. A large, enduring market, we all age, wide variety of uses outside of healthcare, consistent federal support for this, which reduces the cost of capital. But I point out that the groups that control federal support do not include bioengineering. So those of you who are bioengineers always have to struggle to get money. It's an interesting problem. High margins, not quite as high as drugs, but very good, and underserved areas of a variety of sorts. So it's a very attractive area from a practical point of view. So, are there needs? Well, in medicine, there's absolutely no question. There's a broad range of things from dealing with disease and prevention and anticipation and cure. Replacement of function and monitoring are important ones. And by replacement of function, what I mean is simply that if my joint wears out, you can ask, what are the strategies for dealing with a worn-out joint? Because I don't care, in a sense, what it is that gives the function of a bearing that's lubricated. I just want it to do the job and not hurt. And there are a range of techniques for doing that, and I'll show you some of them, but it's that kind of thing, asking where you have a function that you want to have replaced as opposed to a disease that you want to have cured, which will be something which will provide opportunities in this area. So, if you look at this plot, it gives you a sense for some of the realities of the medical world in which this bioengineering kind of thing has to fit. There are actually pretty interesting sorts of curves. This is death from all causes, and something for those of you again to remember: in 1900, the average lifespan in the United States was 42. And the average lifespan now is about 74 or 75. So many of the people who are, well, basically all of us who are our age would be dead, and you all would be halfway through your lifespan. So if you say that the medical profession doesn't work, the medical profession really does do overall a very good job. How much of that is medicine and how much is public health is an interesting question. What are the issues? Heart disease, great progress. Cancer, a little hard to say. It actually seems to be going up and then maybe drifting down, but that's partially because if you don't die of heart disease, you die of something. Stroke goes way down, chronic obstructive lung disease, unintentional injuries. What you draw from this kind of thing, if you think about it for a while, is that if you live longer, because let's assume we make progress with this area, things are going to get, you're going to begin to wear out somehow. And a lot of that wearing out process is where biomaterials will come in. And the basic argument for biomaterials science is that the population will continue to age, and as it ages, replacement of function will have to be done in various ways, and some of those will be biomaterials functions. Is there support for the area? These are actually pretty interesting numbers from a public policy point of view to look at. This is support for the blue, which is NIH and related health kind of stuff. This is all the physical sciences. And what this says, if you're a material scientist, is a reality that I don't think is the right answer, but it's a real answer, and that is where the money is in medicine for research. So all of this, which includes, this part down here is NASA, which is in principle exploring the planets, but it's really taking very large, heavy objects and heaving them into space for unknown purposes. This is all of NIH, NSF, and related things, and it should be arguably here that you put the money, because what has changed the world since World War II has really been information technology. That has been the thing. Not healthcare. Actually, biotech hasn't made that much of a difference in terms of many things. But the fact is that where the money is right now is very strongly in the medical area. So if you want to do material science, medicine is one of the areas that you are obliged to consider. So the basic background argument then is that the past has been things like airframes, computers, and the future is going to be things like this, with the audience being not transportation, not communication, not military systems, but rather human health. All right, so I'd like to classify the problems in material science into 4 broad groups, and I'll talk about all of them. One is healthcare and biomedicine, preventing and treating disease and dysfunction. That's going to be the major part. But there is also an extremely interesting area, one that I know is active here, which is to look at biology, look at the strategies, both structural, control, and other things that are used in biology, and extract those strategies and use them in non-biological systems. That's Steve's control theory kind of thing. So dynamic and out of equilibrium systems, systems we don't know nearly as much as we should, hierarchical systems, and related kinds of things. Then there's the issue of materials from biology, so silk and collagen and maybe intermediates for polymers. Another very interesting area. It's been around for a while. It hasn't yet taken off really, but for specific applications, it's clearly going to be interesting. And then, since any field that's vital has to have a big future in the end, it's probably this one, which is hybrids between living and non-living systems. And that's, in the simplest form, how do I plug my computer into my brain? How do I make a system that is both biologically sentient and, otherwise, how do I make things that are hybrids of biological systems and non-biological systems? And you begin to see these already emerging. I don't know whether all of you follow it, but one of the most exciting areas of this broad field to me is the area in which one causes machinery to move just by thinking about it. That is, you put on something, the something reads patterns in the brain in a neural network-like sense, and those are then used to drive actuator systems that are really remarkably good in allowing you to pick up an object and move it without ever touching it and with no direct control. So that's a non-invasive hybrid system. There are many other more invasive hybrid systems to think about. But very, very exciting stuff for that period. Now, I'd like to make one other important distinction, which is going to be one that we'll touch on here. And this is the distinction between people who build tools and people who use tools. And this is one of those great gaps in science and technology. If you're a tool builder, your view is, I build the tool, I make the NMR machine, and all the rest is technical detail. People image livers with it and do organic chemistry with it, but it's obvious after you've done that. And then if you're on the other side of the gap, you say, I make compounds and I image livers, and I'll do it any way that I want to. And so the tool is, that's something physicists do, but I don't really have to pay a lot of attention to it. Both are essential, but in this area, it is really crucially important to understand that material science builds tools. We're a tool building group. We build tools for doctors to solve problems in dysfunction. That's a tool of some kind. So we build tools. The value of these tools is determined by their users, and what one is really interested in here, as in many things, is function. And that's the key word to pay attention to. You don't care whether it's polyethylene or stainless steel. You care whether it works in vivo to solve a problem. And that in order to determine function, you have to have assays, and the assays must come from biology and medicine. So the intellectual flow in this is such that this is an area in which the physical sciences have to work for the medical sciences. That's the only way this can develop, I think, in an attractive way. All right, so going through this process, function, safety is a key part of this. All of it depends upon assays, and developing and finding functional assays to guide R&D is one of the key barriers to entry in this area, and also a big opportunity. If you can find assays that allow you to build materials that accurately predict the performance of the system in vivo, you can make rapid progress. If you don't have that kind of assay, then you really have a much harder road to hoe, because it's very difficult to tell whether you're developing in the right direction. So what are some examples? It would be good to have a notion of what we're talking about. These are pictures of stents. As you know, most stents are made of laser machined titanium. You put them in an artery which is clogging. You put a balloon on the inside. You blow up the balloon. That blows up the stent, and it works, sort of. These are posts in teeth. I stand before you as someone who had breakfast this morning based on these kinds of technologies, and they work really well. I can't tell the difference between my teeth and those. But it's taken about 20 years of really rotten empiricism to get to something that works. This is a technology that's been hard to deal with. Many people here will get hip replacements. The interesting thing about a hip replacement, at least as it used to be done, is they grout out the part of the hip joint, glue it in with acrylic, and for about 4 days the patient just stinks of acrylate because there's enough of it oozing out. That can't be the right way of doing it. There has to be better ways. So this technology works well, but it needs to be improved. A stent in an expanded form, here's a contact lens, and these are sutures with biodegradable adhesives on biodegradable string on the back. And the area is also interesting in the sense that it has a characteristic that's very different from most areas, in the sense that because of the distribution of federal funds that I showed you, the market for research tools for biomedicine is itself a market. I mean, there's more than enough money just there. And examples of material science here, these are the gels that are used for sequencing. Those gels are a material. They're polyacrylamide. There's no reason to think that they're the best material, but they're the ones that work pretty well. Polystyrene dishes for 96 well plates, or that happens to be not 96 wells, but neither here nor there. These are quantum dots for imaging cells, and those are pipetters doing something. I can't see from here what it's doing. But that business is in the order of, it's getting on toward $20 billion a year or something like that. It's quite a big business. So if you have a good idea, it doesn't have to go into people. It can go into research. And that gives you an entry point, which is a very attractive one. Now, this is an area that bridges between science and engineering. And I would like to start with a little bit of a definition, since both are important. Medicine first. Medicine is engineering. That is, medicine fixes problems often without having a clue of what's going on. That's fine, and you do the best you can. And the view in engineering is you fix it, and then maybe somebody will understand it. And engineering is very stimulating as an area that brings up new ideas. In science, what you do is you understand it, and then you have this sort of wan hope that somebody will eventually find a use for it. And both of these work, but they really have to work together. So it's prototypically an area where one needs both science and engineering. And if you look at the list of uses, these are just some, and for those of you in the back who can't read, wound drainage, hemodialysis products, drug delivery systems, polymers typically, some devices, pacemakers with embedded electrodes, central venous catheters, drip lines, things of that sort, cochlear implant, I'll return to that, contact lenses, dental implants, vascular grafts, IV catheters, biliary stents, and orthopedic implants. That's just some of the list of things that's going on now. The list of products that people are trying to put together is probably 2 or 3 times that. And each one has really, really interesting problems in both material science and in compatibility. But you need to have a strategy. And the point I want to make here is to break up the list of problems into a graded list in terms of material science dominant and then medicine dominant. Think about various parts of replacement that one might like. So for example, with the hip joint, you can imagine building a replacement hip joint mechanically, or mechanical heart gets to be complicated. At the other end of things, there's regenerative medicine, in which you have a heart attack, you have a region of the heart that becomes scar tissue, but you do something which causes the tissue around the edge of the scar to differentiate, invade, replace the scar tissue, and so you replace yourself. We are a long way from being able to do that. We don't know how to do that at the moment, but it clearly is all biology. A grown replacement would be what's called tissue engineering now. You take a part of you take it outside, you grow a bladder, or you grow a kidney, or you grow a heart. Again, it's something that you can imagine, but we don't know how to do it. Transplantation is sort of in between. Here you take it out of a pig or out of one of one hopes, us, and put it into one of you if you need it. But if you look at this gradient, pure medicine that we have only a vague idea how to do, only a vague idea how to do, a pretty good idea how to do and what the difficulties are, and here it's material science. So you want to try to focus your attention on problems in which a solution is not going to be obsoleted by a better biological solution in the immediate future. And I think that, for example, to take teeth, I don't think anybody's going to grow a tooth if a titanium implant works perfectly well. Why would you bother? I suspect people will stick with hip implants even in the place of something more complicated. On the other hand, for a heart or for large areas of skin or things like that, the issue may turn out to be quite different. So ultimately, this technology has to be driven by biology and medicine, and material science should serve, not lead. The fundamental biology to understand this is not in place. If you ask about biocompatibility, we don't understand biocompatibility. We really don't know what goes on. When blood flows over a piece of plastic, it still clots. Platelets still get activated. You would say after all these years we would at least understand what's going on biologically, and the answer is we don't. So the fundamental biology here to connect living systems to man-made systems is not in place. The health problems, all health problems are systems problems and not materials problems. So you put in something, it's not just a question of hip replacement, it's a question of biocompatibility, the inflammatory response, immunology, all that kind of thing. But having said all of that, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, by which I mean, if my hip falls out, I'll take the best replacement I can find. And so if you know something about it as a material scientist and you're talking to a doctor, I think the applications or the opportunities are really unlimited. So here's the kind of decision that I think you need to make in terms of thinking about where an opportunity is. And these are just three examples. One example is controlled release or bioadsorbents. The second is what I'll call fracture putty, and I'll tell you what that is in a moment. A third is tissue engineering. And if you look at these three and look at the level of biological content, in tissue engineering, biological content is very high. I mean, material science may provide a scaffold, but basically getting the cells to grow and to differentiate is essentially a biological problem. In controlled release, you simply have polymers, polylactic, you dissolve a drug in it, and it releases if things work. So that's a material science problem. What about this area in here? And fracture putty is a program that's DARPA has just started a big program, and it's an example. The specification of fracture putty is the following, and the applications are obvious for a military group. You come in with a severe compound fracture, pieces of bone missing and things of that kind. I would like you, as a biomaterials person, to build me a polymer that has the characteristic that I can use it as a kind of putty. I take the bone fragments I have, I put them in place, I connect all this stuff, and then I do something. I photopolymerize, close the wound, and the patient walks out. And then 2 years later, the patient comes back, and all this stuff has been replaced by normal bone. That's what a fracture putty would be. And the reason for it, there are many reasons for it. Military, it's obvious, but even in civilian medicine, if you have a severe compound fracture, the way this is all held in place is with an external metal skeleton. You can't walk for weeks, months, and then you have an open wound, which is a source of infection. You have to do an open procedure to get the stuff out. It would be much better to do this. This is, we think, a practical kind of problem right now. This is certainly practical, but maybe old hat, and this is probably too difficult or too much biological content for material science. So let's look at each of these in a little bit more detail. What is a tissue and why is that hard? Well, an obvious simple tissue is skin. You say, what could be simpler than skin? Because it's just a layer on the outside. But look at what, this is a cross-section through a piece of skin. Here is what skin looks like in a kind of schematic diagram. And you have tissue, you have vascularization, you have layers that are differentiated in very complicated ways. You have transpiration machinery that leads stuff to go from here to here and here to here. The cells in this region are dying and kicking out their nuclei and keratinizing and becoming the stuff that goes out here. I mean, it's really extraordinarily complicated, all of this. So even skin, when you think about a tissue, is hard to do. And people, of course, do make cultured skin, but when you put a piece of cultured skin on a burn, it never really becomes skin. It never really replaces. So even in this relatively simple occasion, there's a lot of biology that needs to be done. Medium difficulty is scaffolds, and this is the kind of thing in which there's a lot of work going on, but it's not all that well founded, and I'll point out just one or two examples. The issue is if you want to build a three-dimensional tissue, suppose you want to build muscle, which is one that people have not been able to do so far. You have to grow it into a three-dimensional shape, which means a scaffold. But there's the shape, there's the surface chemistry, there's the compliance. Probably muscle has the structure that it has because it's constantly being stressed in an anisotropic way. A crucial thing is nutrients, because the interesting thing about you, something you may not have thought about, is that every cell in you is no more than about 200 microns from a flowing stream of blood in a capillary. 200 microns is twice the diameter of a hair. I point optimistically to my head, but imagine that it had hair on it. So you're really, if you took away all the tissue, your form would still be there from this enormous network of capillaries. If you get farther than 200 microns, the cell begins to go anoxic. And so this issue of building into tissue engineering that network of nutrients is crucial. Growth signals, hormones, environmental cues, none of this is present in tissue engineering as it's presently being done. Mechanical signals, making nerves and making nerve connections. All of that, just for something that we think of as being as simple as a muscle, remains to be worked out. Now, let me give you an example of what the kind of thing that material science can do, even at the very simplest level, because I think there's an enormous amount that doesn't have to be complex biology. This is a company I was involved in a couple of years ago, and it's called Geltex. What Geltex made was simply a polyacrylamide gel. Polyacrylamide is the same thing that you use for doing gene sequencing, but it had some positive charge groups and negative charge groups on it that made it relatively selective for phosphate, which sounds completely uninteresting. So why is it interesting? And the answer is that if you eat and if your kidneys are falling out, then you don't have a good way of getting rid of phosphate from the diet because phosphate is excreted in urine. And so you begin to develop phosphate in inappropriate ways, and you deposit phosphate, and there are toxicities that come from this. So the idea is that a patient on renal dialysis or related kinds of conditions would eat this stuff, and it would absorb phosphate. That was the notion. How did we get to this notion? Well, I won't tell you how it all started, but the original idea was to make gels that absorbed sodium. And then we did a little homework and found that a McDonald's milkshake contains 40 grams of sodium in it. And the reason for that is that sodium chloride is the universal flavor enhancer. So you take everything and then you dose it up with sodium chloride and it tastes better. But this would have meant that to get rid of the sodium from a McDonald's milkshake, you would have had to eat something like 3 kilos of this material, and that seemed a little impractical. When it turned out this was a bad idea, we went to phosphate, and it was a desperation act. There were 2 products already on the market, and the total market was $25 million, and the product development guys said, this is a loser, shut down the company, but if you're going to do something, this is the only market we can find. And that's fine, and we went into it. And then after some various and sundry things, we sold the company in 2001, which is, this is only 7 years. Sold it for about $1.3 billion. And the sales at this point from this set of things is in the order of $800 million a year. And $800 million a year is in the order of about $10 billion in market capitalization. Now, my point in that is that a very simple idea in material science, which is a soft, cross-linked ion exchange resin, turns out to solve a really important problem if you just know where to link. And I think that everywhere you go, you'll find gels, degradable polymers, things that have non-sticky surfaces, things that have sticky surfaces, which are all material science problems, which will have the same characteristic. And this is where this number of $90 billion comes from. I mean, the argument is that there's more than enough stuff to be done that you can deal with that kind of volume. Let me give you some researchy ideas. And this section is really intended for those of you in the back who are asking whether this is even doable or not, or is this something so complicated that a human being can't really work with it. Let me give you an example. There is an area of protein pharmaceuticals called PEGylation. And the notion here is that you give a patient a therapeutic protein of some sort, and it has given pharmacokinetics. It lasts in vivo for a certain period of time, and it has a certain distribution in tissue and so on. If you take this material and you attach to it a low molecular weight polymer of polyethylene glycol, the distribution changes, the lifetime changes, and various therapeutic indices change. So you don't do anything more than just attaching a polymer. And this is quite a substantial business now. Here are proteins that are sold in this form. So an interferon for hepatitis C, this material, Neulasta, for neutropenia. This is another hepatitis C drug, and I actually don't know what this stuff does, but it's another protein. And there are something like 10 others in development or in the clinic. Well, you say, okay, this is a solved problem. Of course it's not a solved problem. We don't have any idea how these things work, A. B, there are a gazillion other very interesting polymers that could be attached. There is enormous opportunity just to take proteins and add polymers. This is something which any polymer scientist can do. Why isn't it being done? I think it's just basically because polymer scientists don't know enough about the field to have a very good sense of what's going on. What did I just do there? There we go. Okay. Dextran-coated iron oxide. I should have had a picture of this. Well, there's a picture at scale, of nanometer scale, Dextran-coated iron oxide. You actually can't see it, and I keep doing that. All right, so imagine that you have a black glop which consists of iron oxide, Dextran-coated iron oxide. You inject this into the circulatory system, and in this particular application, this is of more interest to some of you than to others. This is a prostate as viewed by MRI. And what you see here and here are regions, there and there also, which light up in magnetic resonance enhanced contrast, magnetic resonance contrast enhanced images. And what's happened here is the following, that you give this stuff, actually I guess you inject it in this particular case, it is taken up by macrophages in the region of the tumor and then carried by those macrophages or carried by those lymphocytes to the local lymph nodes. And so what you can do is to use this to trace the pathway of migration of lymphocytes from the region of a tumor to local lymph nodes, which are the place where you expect metastases to occur. Now, here are examples, and the claim is that you can see a metastasis that's in the order of 100 microns. It's interesting to me, and I don't understand the arguments, that this material is not used in the United States, it's used in Europe. But the claim is that knowing this pathway is interesting scientifically and interesting medically, but actually doesn't help the patient, because once you have the information, it's not clear what you do with it. I don't understand that argument, but I'm not on that part of the FDA. But it's another example of a material science product that is biocompatibilized, Dextran-coated magnetite, which has a big magnetic moment and changes the relaxation times of water in the serum in the immediate vicinity. Here's the picture, and then this is a picture of the cerebrovascular circulation, and it's just a contrast with a soft tissue image by MRI. So this lights up certain features very well, and that lights up other features quite well. Now, let me begin to move toward the end by talking about some areas where there are emerging technologies and some science. Here's an example of something which I talked about at the beginning, which is the idea of materials from biology. And there are a host of interesting opportunities here. Some of them are beginning to be exploited, some are not. This is the structure of fibronectin, which is a protein that's very important in cellular adhesion. In fibronectin, there is a loop that extends out in this fashion, which contains an RGD, asp-gly-arg unit, which is recognized by some of the proteins that are responsible for cellular adhesion. So by working with materials that have RGD on them, attached to them, you can regulate where cells attach and where cells don't attach. This is an example of a material, or at least a hint from biology, that leads to other interesting kinds of materials for applications. Another very interesting area of science right now, which has so far not led to practical applications, but it's characteristic of science that one starts with something that is driven by curiosity and moves from there. Polymer science is the science of large molecules. And the characteristic of polymers is, as they're made, they're almost all polydisperse, so they have a range of molecular weights. Suppose you would like to have polymers that are monodisperse. How do you make them? The answer is we don't have any idea how to make them right now. People have tried for a long time how to do that, to find ways of doing it. But in fact, there is a very good procedure for doing it, which is simply to use proteins. The proteins have specific molecular weights determined by the gene. And the question now comes up, can you use proteins as polymers, monodisperse polymers? Does the monodispersity give you something of value? Or is it possible that by working with a monodisperse polymer and doing a modification that you can get something of value? And this field has moved sufficiently far that you can demonstrate pretty clearly that you can make monodisperse polymers. Here is this is a gel permeation chromatogram of a protein that has been modified, and you can see the monodispersity is extremely good. Now the question is, what do you do with it? That remains to be seen. But this is an area of science in the materials world which is at the level of science, but not yet the area of application. And then, of course, this one has been around for a while. The question here is toughness of materials. The abalone and many shells, the abalone as an animal has a problem, which is, as an animal, it's a soft and relatively tasty thing in a world full of predators. So if you are that way, how are you going to build yourself a house that protects you? And the answer is you build some kind of armored case, but what do you build it out of? And there's that much of a range of opportunity, and what the abalone uses is basically calcium carbonate, which is quite fragile. All of you have seen calcium carbonate. So how does it make something that's as tough as abalone shell is? And what the abalone does is to construct a series of plates that are in the order of less than a micron thick, single crystal, separated by thin layers of a resilient protein. So it's a single crystal calcium carbonate protein polymer composite that has the characteristic that when a crack moves through this, instead of just cleaving through the calcium carbonate, it has to follow all these paths. You enormously increase the length of the surface that you have to generate, and hence increase the fracture toughness. So this principle has actually been used fairly extensive now in areas like ballistic armor. And the motivation came, in fact, at least in part from this. You say, what else can you do? Well, here is an example of an interesting organism that my colleague Joanna Eisenberg works with. This is called a brittle star. And the skeleton in the brittle star is also made of calcium carbonate. But it turns out that in that case, the calcium carbonate skeleton also acts as a series of light pipes to transmit light around in the organism. So the idea of looking at these simple organisms and then figuring out how you build complex function from materials that you would not have guessed would have had that level of functionality in them is something which I think is an extremely stimulating area. Nanoparticles, I'm sure you've all seen this. So these are cadmium selenide particles, and here they're stuck in mice or rats. The issue with these, again, it's a material science issue. This works, you can do imaging, but the problem is that you know that both cadmium and selenium are toxic. So how do you make nanoparticles that have the characteristic that they're good fluorophores but perfectly bioinert? It's a well-posed scientific problem. We just have to figure out how to solve it. And these are examples of surfaces that have, here's a cell on a surface that's unpatterned. Here is a cell on a surface that's been patterned into a region that's adhesive and a surrounding region that's not adhesive. That's a biosurface problem. And what you begin to see here is how the cell senses its environment. You say this entire region in here is adhesive. What is it doing? And apparently what it does is to glue itself down with a string of glue around the outside, and then the inside is free floating. We have no idea why it does that. And more of the same kind of thing. This is just the ways of using materials, in this case, to measure mechanical strength in what is basically pure science. What you see here is cells that are sitting on a soft polymer. And when the cells pull, what they do is to cause the polymer to wrinkle. And by looking at that pattern of wrinkling and knowing the mechanical properties of the polymer, you can then back calculate the forces that the cell exerts on the surface. So let me now finish with a couple of things that are speculative. These are areas that are attracting a lot of attention in the material science community and in which there's almost, I think, unlimited opportunity for science, but also great difficulty. One of the things that people note is that biological systems are self-healing. I break a leg, and the leg repairs itself. So why can't I build an airplane in which it breaks a wing or a landing gear, and the landing gear repairs itself, or you put a bullet through the thing and it repairs itself? And it's a very interesting thing to think about. But the way to start at this is to think about what happens in bone healing. And what happens when you break a leg is you break the leg, here's the reason of the fracture. That first fills with a hematoma, and this becomes a clot. Then the various factors induce the migration of cells into this, which reforms the circulatory system. With that circulatory system and nutrients and oxygen, cells can begin to migrate and work in this area, damaged area, to deposit a kind of low-grade bone called callus. And then over a period of time, the callus is replaced by normal bone. All of you, I'm sure, have had a broken bone, and what you note is that when the bone first heals, it's quite thick, and then over the course of time, that shrinks down, and that reflects the formation of callus and then this. Now, how does that process occur? And it occurs by the concerted action of two classes of cells. There are osteoclasts, which migrate through the bone, basically pinning down their edges and secreting hydrochloric acid to dissolve the bone, and then walking away, and that fresh surface is then colonized by osteoblasts, which sit there and deposit a layer of normal bone. All of this being done in a way that's orchestrated in some fashion that we don't understand by the stress that's applied to the bone. So it's very stress responsive. All that's really interesting. The question is, how would you do that with a titanium landing gear? And the answer is we don't have a clue. So it's something in which you can see an immensely interesting, complicated process in biology, which will suggest strategies for self-healing, but we don't know where and how. So it's wonderful science. Here's a second area. This is retinal prostheses. Vision is quite interesting in the sense that what happens in vision is that there's something out there, an attractive object like Bob Nerum, who the photons from Bob Nerum come to my lens. They are focused, and there's a planar projection of Bob Nerum on my retina. So there's a one-to-one mapping from the two-dimensional thing out there onto the retina. And then that's then transformed into nerve impulses, which go to the back of my head, and various things happen. What's interesting about this is that there is a geographical mapping from the retina to what I see. And so the argument is that if I go into the retina, I might be able to put a pattern of electrodes into this, stimulate the retina that way, and be able to see indirectly. So there is now a fairly active program to build focal plane arrays which can be implanted, inserted into the eye. These have electrodes on the back. The electrodes will be driven into the retina in the appropriate regions. Those will act as electrodes to stimulate nerves which are presumed still to be active, to go back to this region of the brain. This whole thing would be powered externally, inductively, and the information required to provide this focal plane array with the information it needs would come from a camera and then external whatever. All of that sounds extremely complicated, but in fact, there actually have been experiments now at a very simple level in which electrode arrays of this sort enable people to see the distinction between, the letter 1 and the number 8, that kind of level of detail. It's pretty primitive, but the example where this has now worked, which I would have thought equally improbable as this one, which is cochlear implants. And for people who have functioning nerves in the cochlea but are missing the nerve cells, among other things, what you do is basically take a wire with bands on it, individually addressable electrodes, wind it into this snail shell-like shape, and then this is connected by a wire to a receiver and a transmitter up here and a battery and all the rest of it. And so sound comes in here. It's separated into something in the order of 25 different frequency bands. These separate bands are used to excite the 25 separate electrodes down here, and then those excitations are picked up and transmitted as nerve impulses into the brain. And it works really quite well. I mean, at least I've heard simulations of what patients hear under these circumstances, and they're very good for speech, and interestingly, absolutely awful for music. You can't listen to music if you have a cochlear implant, I'm told. Now, the really big science problem here at the end is this one. How do I plug my computer into my brain? We pass by the question of whether I want to plug my computer into my brain, or more properly, whether I want Bob's brain plugged into my computer and then plugged into my brain. I would just assume not share this. But there's a really interesting scientific problem here, which is that the basic currency of wires and our information systems are electrons, and we store information in magnetic domains, and we sometimes use photons. But basically, we move charge around, move information in terms of charge and photons, and we do storage in magnetic domains. And in nerves, information is moved around in terms of neurotransmitters and action potentials, and then there are these funny things that we as large mammals have called synapses. So in a wire, I simply apply a potential here, and the electrons in the wire shift, and I know what happens at the other end. Here, I have an action potential with Schwann cells involved, and they get to this point, and they release a chemical which diffuses across a gap, which picks up something here, which starts the process over again. What we have to have is some way of moving from one of these currencies to the other, and right now we don't know how to do that. So it's a very core problem in science, which we have to solve first the currency exchange problem, and then how to do the addressing in 3 dimensions with very small things, and we don't know how to do either of those. So this is, this fits into, in a Kuhnian sense, what Mr. Kuhn calls a problem, as opposed to a puzzle. That is, it is something which you don't know it can be done, you don't know how it can be done, you don't know any strategy for getting there, but people really do care about the result. If you could do this, it would make an enormous difference in the way the world worked. So it's at the opposite end from a scaffold for tissue engineering. I mean, one is doable, but the yield is important, but it's science that we know how to do. This we don't know how to do. Now, just a couple of final things. This is science of a somewhat different kind. Everything that I've talked about up to this point has been materials for high-technology Western medicine. But there are a bunch of other problems as well. There's the third world, in which healthcare absolutely requires low cost. And then there are issues of a national security sort, like biodefense or border security or environmental monitoring. And thinking about those problems is also important. And here, I think, is a spectacularly interesting example. In the developing world, of course, people have the same ocular problems that they do in our world.
So how do you provide eyeglasses? And the idea here is that there's a generic eyeglass, and the lens, instead of being glass, is two pieces of, I think, PDMS or Mylar or something like that, and you simply pump into this silicone oil. And you put it on the patient, and you pump in until you get the best results you can. Now, you don't fix astigmatism, you don't fix a lot of other things, but you provide up to 6 diopters of straight correction. The claim is that you can do these things for about $10 a piece, and one size fits all. So here's a young woman who looks very happy with being able to see something, and it may not be a really fashion statement that she's making with her glasses there, but I don't think she cares all that much. So it's a different kind of material science with a different objective, but I think very interesting and very important. Now, I'll give you an example from our own work. What you see here is a piece of paper. We have a big program in this area now funded by our friends in Gates. This is a piece of paper. This is a hydrophobic polymer. And what we've done is to pattern a drop of something that detects glucose here and something that detects protein here. So you put a drop of urine in here. It wicks its way up. It distributes itself into these 3 ports. This part turns colored depending upon how much glucose there is. This part turns colored depending upon how much protein there is. And then, in fact, what we do is to take a picture of that with a cell phone and send it to a central facility where a doctor, in principle, looks at it. But the reason for being interested in this is that you can make an estimate that the cost of this on scale might be a tenth or a hundredth of a cent, because you basically make it the same way you make comic books. And you say, well, that's sort of low technology. Actually, it's not. Understanding how to work with fibers, how to think about wicking, how to think about heat transport and mass transport in porous media, how to build these kinds of systems, turns out to present all kinds of really interesting problems. And, by the way, if this works in the developing world, it has the potential for changing the cost of the healthcare structure in the developed world, because it then makes the step toward making information free and moving away from the current business model, which is sell reagents and make money on the reagents, to one in which the reagents, the information becomes free, and all the money comes in manipulating, all the value comes in manipulating free information. Fundamentally different structure. So really interesting from that point of view. That's just how it's done. Sorry, I meant to take those out. Actually, I did take them out in the thing, which probably is the other title, but that's neither here nor there. All right, so let me do conclusions. No. Conclusions. There are, for one thing, an enormous range. You can't read, but it's not important. Any review will give you this. There's an enormous range of applications. Wound, burn kinds of things, catheters, controlled release, diabetes control, neurological repair, orthopedics, whatever, in which one needs new kinds of biomaterials. So there's no shortage of materials, no shortage of problems in materials. Some of the key ideas that you need to think about are biocompatibility, having function-relevant bioassays. You need to think about safety and liability from the beginning. You need to incorporate into a system that doctors can and will use, and I'll just give you an example there. FDA clearance. Without FDA clearance, you get nowhere. You need to think about how you're going to be reimbursed, an important issue, thought leaders in marketing, and financial and social return. Let me just give you a flavor of the area, incorporation in a system that doctors can use. At one point, I was involved in developing hyaluronic acid as an anti-adhesive. People go in, they open you up, they rearrange something or they cut something out, and in doing that, they rub surfaces against one another, they abrade, and then what happens is those surfaces glue against one another. That's called an adhesion, and that's a nuisance. So hyaluronic acid is a biopolymer that comes from a variety of sources and which really makes things beautifully slippery so they don't abrade. And so we made thin sheets of bioadhesive, we being Genzyme, of this stuff which got wrapped around a kidney or a uterus or whatever it was while people were working with things. The doctors hated it. And why the doctors hate it? Because they'd go in and all of a sudden, flunk, the kidney would pop out or the uterus would pop out or something like this. And it was too slippery. And so it's really they that are the right people. And you have to think about something that they can use, because if it solves the problem as you see it, but it doesn't solve the problem as they see it, if it's, it's too sticky, they can't get their hands on it, they can't control it, they can't see it. Those are all things that are really critically important, and you can only get that by talking to them. So my case for this area, and here I know I'm talking to the converted. The case is that there are a variety of outcomes, all of them desirable in this case. In biomedicine, treatment of trauma and disease, new prostheses, indwelling sensors, we haven't talked about that, but a big deal. New science, tools for biology and understanding of all of the things in biology that are not molecular. Invention, understanding how biological systems work in a dynamic and hierarchical and out of equilibrium system, and functional nanosystems, biology is full of those, and maybe ultimately hybrid systems. So for example, putting together living and non-living systems, or having the body power an electrical battery. How do you do that kind of thing? And then finally, these issues that we've been talking about in national security, of developing world healthcare, biodefense, changing the cost structure in the US, and then some other areas that I haven't talked about. So the area is one that has, to me, enormous potential in all ways. I do think that it is one of the most attractive opportunities for material science. I do think it's one in which the medical doctors are there to be helpful but will not come up with the solutions, and in which the enormous already in place pharmaceutical industry is not competing with you, which is an important area. You're not in biomaterials having to deal with N billion dollars a year of investment that's already in place. You can go and sort of invent it on your own. So it's an extremely attractive area, and one that's very important and will seem, I should say, even more important to you as you get older and things begin to fail. Thank you very much.